When darkness falls, most people retreat to the safety of their homes, lock their doors, and sleep peacefully through the night. But scattered throughout history are individuals who used that darkness as cover for unspeakable acts. These aren't the household names that dominate true crime documentaries. These aren't the killers whose faces stare back at you from every streaming platform. These are the monsters who slipped through the cracks of history, leaving behind trails of horror that most people never heard about. Tonight, we're diving into the twisted minds of 5 of the most evil serial killers you've probably never encountered. Jane Toppen, who turned healing into murder. Francisco de Assis Pereira, Brazil's park maniac who terrorized an entire city. Robert Hansen, the Alaskan hunter who made women his prey. Adolfo Constanzo, who mixed murder with black magic in the most disturbing ways imaginable. And Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, a duo whose crimes were so depraved they redefined what evil looks like. These stories aren't just about murder. They're about predators who understood how to exploit trust, manipulate systems, and hide in plain sight for years. They're about the thin line between civilization and chaos, and how quickly that line can be crossed when someone decides that other human beings are nothing more than objects for their twisted fantasies. What makes these cases so chilling isn't just the brutality. It's the calculated nature of the crimes, the way these killers integrated seamlessly into society, and the sheer number of victims whose stories were almost lost to time. Each of these predators found ways to access vulnerable people, whether through professional authority, geographic isolation, or psychological manipulation. Let me start with a story that will make you question everything you think you know about trust and authority. In the summer of 1901, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a family was preparing for what should have been a joyous celebration. Instead, they were planning a funeral. The victim was a healthy middle-aged man who had fallen mysteriously ill just days before. The mourners whispered about bad luck, about how death seemed to follow certain people like a shadow. What they didn't know was that death wasn't following anyone. Death was being delivered by gentle hands, with a warm smile, by someone they trusted completely. Her name was Jane Toppen, and she had been killing for over a decade. Jane wasn't your typical serial killer. She didn't lurk in alleys or break into homes under cover of darkness. She didn't need to hunt for victims because they came to her willingly. She was a nurse, and in an era when medical knowledge was limited and death was common, no one questioned why patients under her care had such a high mortality rate. To the families she served, Jane was an angel of mercy. To her victims, she was the angel of death. Born Honora Kelly in 1857, Jane's early life was marked by abandonment and instability. Her mother died when she was young, and her father, unable to cope, gave her and her sister away to an orphanage. From there, she was sent to live with a family who treated her more like a servant than a daughter. She never legally adopted their name, but she took it anyway, becoming Jane Toppen, a name that would eventually become synonymous with betrayal and murder. Jane found her calling in nursing, a profession that in the 1880s required little formal training but offered something she craved desperately: power over life and death. She began her career at Cambridge Hospital, where she quickly gained a reputation for being exceptionally dedicated to her patients. She would sit with them for hours, holding their hands, whispering reassurances, staying with them through their final moments. The families were grateful. The doctors were impressed. No one suspected that Jane was experimenting on her patients like they were laboratory rats. Her method was insidious and nearly impossible to detect. She would administer doses of morphine and atropine, drugs that were commonly used in hospitals at the time. But Jane wasn't using them to heal. She was using them to kill, slowly and methodically, while she watched the life drain from her victim's eyes. She later confessed that she derived sexual pleasure from these deaths, from the intimate control she had over another person's final moments. Jane's first confirmed victim was an elderly man named Israel Dunham. She had been hired as his private nurse, and within days of her arrival, he was dead. The family was heartbroken, but grateful for Jane's compassionate care during his final hours. They had no idea that she had been the one orchestrating those final hours, adjusting his medication not to ease his pain, but to prolong his suffering while maintaining the appearance of natural death. What made Jane so dangerous was her intelligence and her ability to read people. She understood that families in grief were vulnerable, that they wanted to believe their loved one had died peacefully under the care of someone who truly cared. She played this role perfectly, becoming the ideal nurse, the woman you'd want at your bedside during your darkest hour. But beneath that compassionate exterior was a predator who saw patients not as human beings, but as opportunities to satisfy her twisted desires. Her killing spree escalated when she left the hospital and began working as a private nurse. This gave her even more control over her victims and their environment. She could isolate them from family members, control their medication, and manipulate the narrative around their deaths. She targeted the elderly, the infirm, and anyone who wouldn't be able to fight back or raise suspicion about their declining health. The Davis family hired Jane in the summer of 1901 to care for their patriarch, Alden Davis, who was recovering from a minor illness. Within weeks, Alden was dead. Jane expressed such grief over his passing that the family asked her to stay on and help care for other family members. It was like inviting a wolf to guard the sheep. One by one, members of the Davis family began falling ill under Jane's care. Mattie Davis, Alden's daughter, died next. Then Genevieve Gordon, Mattie's sister. Each death seemed tragic, but explainable given the family's apparent run of bad luck. But Jane had made a critical error. She had killed too many people in too short a time span, all connected to the same family. When the bodies started piling up, even the most trusting relatives began to question what was happening. The surviving family members demanded autopsies, something that Jane had managed to avoid with her previous victims. The results were damning. The bodies contained lethal levels of morphine and atropine, drugs that Jane had access to and knowledge of how to administer. When confronted with the evidence, Jane's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. She confessed not just to the Davis family murders, but to a killing spree that had lasted over a decade. During her confession, Jane revealed the true scope of her crimes and the disturbing psychology behind them. She admitted to killing at least 31 people, though investigators believed the actual number was much higher. She described in detail how she would experiment with different drug combinations, watching her victims' reactions with clinical fascination. She talked about the sexual gratification she derived from having complete control over another person's life, about how she would sometimes revive her victims just to kill them again more slowly. What's perhaps most chilling about Jane's confession is how matter of fact she was about her crimes. She showed no remorse, no recognition that her victims were human beings with families who loved them. To her, they were simply objects for her experimentation and gratification. She once told investigators that her ambition was to have killed more people helpless than any other man or woman who ever lived. Jane Toppen was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a state hospital where she lived until her death in 1938. She spent her final decades in relative comfort, receiving visitors and maintaining correspondence with people who were fascinated by her story. She never expressed regret for her actions, never acknowledged the pain she had caused to dozens of families. Her case highlighted the vulnerabilities in the medical system of her era, where a single person could have unsupervised access to vulnerable patients and deadly drugs. But it also revealed something darker about human nature, about how someone could use a profession dedicated to healing as a cover for systematic murder. Jane Toppen didn't kill out of rage or desperation. She killed because she enjoyed it, because it gave her a sense of power and control that she couldn't find anywhere else in her life. The families of her victims were left to grapple not just with their loss, but with the betrayal of trust that her crimes represented. They had invited her into their homes, trusted her with their most vulnerable loved ones, and she had repaid that trust with murder. The second killer we need to examine is Francisco de Assis Pereira, a man whose charming exterior concealed one of Brazil's most horrifying predators. While Jane Toppen used her medical position to mask her murders, Francisco weaponized something far more insidious: the dreams and aspirations of young women seeking their break in the modeling industry. In the bustling streets of Sao Paulo during the late 1990s, Francisco de Assis Pereira walked among crowds like any other middle-aged man. Average height, unremarkable appearance, the kind of face that blended seamlessly into the urban landscape. But behind that ordinary facade lurked a calculating monster who understood exactly how to exploit vulnerability and ambition. The media would later dub him the Park Maniac, a name that barely scratched the surface of his depravity. Francisco was born in 1967 in the impoverished outskirts of Sao Paulo. His childhood was marked by instability and neglect, bouncing between relatives and foster situations that offered little structure or emotional support. Like many serial killers, his early years were filled with warning signs that went unnoticed or ignored. He displayed concerning behavior toward animals, struggled with authority figures, and showed an early fascination with control and manipulation. By his 20s, Francisco had developed what appeared to be a legitimate career in the entertainment industry. He worked as a talent scout and photographer, roles that gave him access to Sao Paulo's vibrant modeling scene. On the surface, this seemed like a natural fit. He was articulate, presentable, and understood how to talk to young women about their dreams of fame and fortune. But Francisco wasn't building a career. He was constructing the perfect hunting ground. Sao Paulo in the 1990s was a city of contrasts. Economic inequality created desperate situations for many families, particularly those with young daughters who saw modeling as their ticket out of poverty. Francisco understood this desperation intimately and exploited it with surgical precision. He would approach attractive young women in shopping centers, on the street, or through classified advertisements, presenting himself as a legitimate talent scout with connections to major modeling agencies. His approach was masterful in its simplicity and believability. Francisco carried professional-looking business cards, wore decent clothing, and spoke with authority about the modeling industry. He would compliment a young woman's appearance, tell her she had the look that agencies were seeking, and offer to arrange a photo shoot or meeting with industry contacts. To girls from poor families, these promises felt like divine intervention. The pattern Francisco established was both methodical and terrifying. He would arrange to meet his victims at shopping centers or other public locations, always maintaining the facade of professionalism. He would then suggest they travel to a more secluded location for the supposed photo shoot, often one of Sao Paulo's many parks, which he claimed provided better natural lighting and a more authentic backdrop for modeling portfolios. Once isolated with his victims, Francisco's true nature emerged. The charming talent scout vanished, replaced by a violent predator who had lured these young women into carefully chosen killing grounds. His victims were raped, brutally murdered, and their bodies left in the remote areas of parks around Sao Paulo. The contrast between their dreams of stardom and the horrific reality of their final moments represents one of the most tragic aspects of Francisco's crimes. What made Francisco particularly dangerous was his ability to read people and situations. He could identify which young women were most vulnerable, those from broken homes, those facing financial hardship, those desperate enough to believe his promises, despite any nagging doubts they might have had. He understood that ambition and desperation could override caution, and he used this psychological insight to devastating effect. Between 1997 and 1998, Francisco's killing spree escalated dramatically. His victims were typically between the ages of 15 and 25, all sharing certain physical characteristics that appealed to his twisted preferences. They were found in various parks throughout Sao Paulo, Ibirapuera Park, Villa Lobos Park, and other green spaces that should have been places of recreation and peace, not graveyards for young dreams. The investigation into these murders initially struggled to find connections between the crimes. The victims came from different neighborhoods, different social circles, and were found in different locations across the sprawling metropolis. But as the body count rose, patterns began to emerge. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the victims with a middle-aged man who claimed to be involved in the modeling industry. These reports, combined with the similar age and appearance of the victims, finally gave police the breakthrough they needed. Francisco's downfall came through a combination of investigative work and a crucial mistake on his part. In July 1998, he approached a young woman named Elaine Barros at a shopping center, using his usual routine about modeling opportunities. However, Elaine was more cautious than his previous victims. She agreed to meet with him, but brought along a friend and insisted on staying in public areas. When Francisco became pushy about moving to a more private location, Elaine's suspicions were aroused, and she managed to escape. Elaine's report to police provided the first detailed description of Francisco's methods and appearance. This information, combined with witness accounts from the various crime scenes, allowed investigators to create a composite sketch and develop a profile of their suspect. The net was closing, but Francisco remained at large, continuing to hunt for new victims. The end came in August 1998 when Francisco approached 19-year-old Caterina Perez with his familiar pitch about modeling opportunities. Caterina was initially interested, but became suspicious when Francisco insisted on taking her to an isolated location. Like Elaine before her, she attempted to leave, but this time Francisco couldn't afford to let a potential witness escape. In broad daylight, in a public area, he attacked Caterina with shocking violence. Fortunately for Caterina, her screams attracted the attention of passers-by who intervened before Francisco could complete his attack. In the chaos that followed, Francisco was subdued by bystanders and held until police arrived. For the first time in his killing career, the park maniac had been caught in the act. Under interrogation, Francisco initially maintained his innocence, claiming he was simply a legitimate talent scout who had been misunderstood. But as the evidence mounted against him, witness testimonies, DNA evidence, and items belonging to victims found in his possession, his facade began to crumble. Eventually, faced with overwhelming proof of his crimes, Francisco confessed to a series of murders that shocked even experienced investigators. His confessions revealed the true scope of his predatory behavior. Francisco admitted to killing at least 9 young women, though investigators believe the actual number may be higher. He described his crimes with a disturbing lack of emotion, treating them as business transactions rather than the destruction of human lives. He showed no remorse for his victims, instead expressing frustration at being caught and anger toward the women who had disappointed him by not cooperating with his schemes. The trial of Francisco de Assis Pereira became a media sensation in Brazil, highlighting not only the horror of his crimes, but also the broader social issues that had made his victims vulnerable in the first place. The case exposed the exploitation that often occurs in the modeling industry, where young women from disadvantaged backgrounds are particularly susceptible to predators who promise fame and fortune. Francisco's psychological profile revealed a man who saw other people merely as objects to be used for his gratification. Unlike some serial killers who are driven by obvious mental illness or traumatic experiences, Francisco appeared to be motivated primarily by a desire for power and control. He enjoyed the process of deception as much as the violence itself, the elaborate charade of being a talent scout, the careful selection of victims, and the manipulation required to isolate them. The impact of Francisco's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. Families were shattered, communities lived in fear, and an entire industry came under scrutiny for its practices and lack of safeguards. The case led to increased awareness about the tactics used by predators who target aspiring models and performers, but it also highlighted how difficult it can be to protect people whose desperation makes them willing to take risks that they might otherwise avoid. In 1999, Francisco de Assis Pereira was convicted of multiple counts of murder and rape. He was sentenced to over 120 years in prison, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to prey on vulnerable young women. He remains incarcerated in Brazil's prison system, where he has largely faded from public attention. The case of Francisco de Assis Pereira serves as a chilling reminder of how predators can exploit legitimate industries and societal structures to access victims. His ability to masquerade as a professional talent scout for an extended period demonstrates the importance of verification and caution, even when opportunities seem legitimate and appealing. The dreams and aspirations that make us human can also make us vulnerable to those who would exploit our hopes for their own twisted purposes. Francisco's story also illustrates the particular vulnerability of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who may be more willing to trust strangers offering opportunities that seem too good to be true. His crimes represent not just individual acts of violence, but a broader exploitation of social and economic inequalities that continue to exist in societies around the world. The Park Maniac case remains one of Brazil's most notorious serial killer cases, not only because of the brutality of the crimes, but because of the calculated way Francisco used societal structures to facilitate his murders. Moving from the shadowy streets of Brazil to the frozen wilderness of Alaska, we encounter our next killer who turned isolation into his hunting ground. Robert Hansen didn't need the bustling crowds of a city to feed his twisted desires. Instead, he found something far more sinister in the vast emptiness of America's last frontier. In the early 1980s, women began disappearing from Anchorage, Alaska. Not all at once, not in a way that screamed serial killer. They vanished quietly, one by one, mostly dancers and sex workers from the seedier parts of town. People the system didn't prioritize, people whose absence didn't immediately trigger manhunts or front-page headlines. It was the perfect hunting ground for a predator who understood that in Alaska, you could make someone disappear forever. Robert Christian Hansen was born in 1939 in Estherville, Iowa, into what appeared to be a typical Midwestern family. His father was a Danish immigrant who ran a bakery, his mother a quiet woman who kept the household running. But beneath that ordinary surface, young Robert was already showing the warning signs that would later explode into something monstrous. He was awkward, painfully shy, and cursed with a severe stutter that made him a target for relentless bullying at school. The stutter wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a source of deep shame that ate away at him. Kids mocked him mercilessly, girls rejected him, and Robert began to retreat into a world of fantasy where he had the power. He found solace in hunting, spending hours alone in the Iowa countryside with a rifle, tracking deer and small game. For the first time in his life, he felt in control. He was the predator, the animals were prey, and there was something intoxicating about that dynamic. By his 20s, Robert had married and started a family, but the rage never left him. He began acting out in disturbing ways, starting small fires around town, stealing women's underwear, and committing petty burglaries. In 1960, he was arrested for burning down a school bus garage. When questioned, he showed no remorse, only cold calculation. The incident should have been a red flag, but Robert was sentenced to just a few years in prison, and when he got out, he moved his family to Alaska. Alaska in the 1970s was a place where men could reinvent themselves. The oil boom was bringing money and opportunity, but it was also drawing drifters, criminals, and people running from their past. Robert opened a bakery in Anchorage, just like his father had in Iowa. To his neighbors and customers, he seemed like a hard-working family man who'd found his place in the world. He was quiet, polite, and successful. What they didn't know was that Robert had also become an expert hunter, spending his free time tracking big game across the Alaskan wilderness. He knew every trail, every hiding spot, every remote cabin for hundreds of miles around Anchorage. He could track an animal for days, kill it cleanly, and pack out the meat without leaving a trace. These skills, honed over years of legitimate hunting, would soon be put to a much darker purpose. The killing began around 1973, though the exact timeline remains murky because Robert was methodical about choosing victims who wouldn't be missed quickly. He targeted women working in Anchorage's red light district, runaways and dancers who were new to the city and had few local connections. His method was as calculated as his hunting trips. Robert would approach these women in his car, sometimes posing as a customer, sometimes offering them money for what seemed like easy work. He was middle-aged, well-dressed, and drove a nice car. He didn't look dangerous. Once he got them into his vehicle, he would drive them to its remote cabin in the Kinnick River area, about an hour outside Anchorage. There, the true horror would begin. Robert had turned his hunting cabin into a torture chamber. He would chain his victims inside, keeping them prisoner for days or sometimes weeks. He would rape them repeatedly, torture them, and force them to participate in his twisted fantasies. But the worst part was still to come. After days of abuse, Robert would make his victims an offer. He would give them a head start to run into the wilderness, and if they could evade him, they could go free. It was a lie, of course. Robert had no intention of letting anyone escape. What he was doing was turning human beings into prey for the ultimate hunting experience. He would give his victims a few minutes or maybe an hour to run, then he would come after them with his rifle and his intimate knowledge of the terrain. The women, already weakened by days of torture, barefoot and barely clothed, had no real chance of survival in the harsh Alaskan wilderness. For Robert, this was the culmination of every fantasy he'd ever had about power and control. He was no longer the stuttering boy who got picked on at school. He was the apex predator, and these women were his trophies. After killing them, he would often bury the bodies in remote locations or simply leave them for the animals and elements to dispose of. This nightmare continued for over a decade. Robert's hunting trips became more frequent, and his confidence grew. He became sloppy, keeping jewelry and personal items from his victims as trophies in his home. He even marked locations on aviation maps, noting where he dumped bodies, like a hunter marking successful kills. The beginning of the end came in June 1983, when Robert made a critical mistake. He picked up a 17-year-old prostitute named Cindy Paulson and drove her to his cabin. But Cindy was different from his other victims. She was street smart, tough, and refused to give up hope. When Robert chained her in his cabin and began his usual routine of torture and rape, Cindy played along, making him believe she was compliant. When Robert offered her the same deal he'd given all the others, a head start to run for her life, Cindy was ready. Instead of running blindly into the wilderness like his previous victims, she stayed close to the cabin and waited for her moment. When Robert left to get his rifle and hunting gear, Cindy managed to escape her restraints and run back toward the main road. Against all odds, she made it. Bloodied, traumatized, and barely clothed, Cindy flagged down a passing motorist and was taken to the hospital. When police arrived to take her statement, they were skeptical. Cindy was a known prostitute with a criminal record, and her story sounded too bizarre to believe. A respected businessman who owned a bakery, hunting women for sport in the Alaskan wilderness? It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but Cindy's description of Robert Hansen was too detailed to dismiss. She knew things about him that only someone who'd been to his cabin could know. She described his stutter, his plane, the layout of his cabin, even specific hunting trophies on his walls. Slowly, investigators began to take her seriously. When they searched Robert's home and cabin, they found a house of horrors, maps marked with body locations, jewelry belonging to missing women, weapons, and detailed records of his crimes. Robert had kept meticulous notes about his victims, rating their performance as prey, describing their final moments like entries in a hunting journal. Under interrogation, Robert initially denied everything, but when faced with the overwhelming evidence, he began to confess. What emerged was a killing spree that had lasted over a decade and claimed at least 17 lives, though investigators believe the true number could be much higher. Robert described his crimes with the same clinical detachment he might use to describe a successful hunting trip. He talked about the thrill of the chase, the satisfaction of a clean kill, the careful disposal of the evidence. To him, these weren't murders. They were hunts, and the women weren't victims. They were game animals. The case sent shockwaves through Alaska. This wasn't some drifter or obvious psychopath. This was a pillar of the community, a successful businessman who'd been living a double life for over a decade. How many other Robert Hansens were out there, hiding behind respectable facades? In 1984, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to a maximum security facility in Pennsylvania, as far from Alaska as possible. For 30 years, he lived quietly behind bars, rarely speaking to guards or other inmates, never granting interviews or showing any remorse for his crimes. Robert died in prison in 2014 at the age of 75. His death was as unremarkable as his life had appeared to be before his crimes were discovered. But his legacy lives on in the families of his victims, in the changes made to how police investigate cases involving marginalized women, and in the chilling reminder that monsters often hide behind the most ordinary faces. Even today, searchers occasionally find human remains in the Alaskan wilderness that might be connected to Robert Hansen. The vast, unforgiving landscape that he used as his killing ground continues to give up its secrets slowly, decades after his capture. Each discovery is a reminder of the women who died alone and terrified, hunted like animals by a man who saw them as nothing more than prey. The case of Robert Hansen reveals something disturbing about how society values certain lives over others. His victims were chosen specifically because they were marginalized, because their disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate investigations, because they were seen as disposable. The fourth figure in our collection of forgotten monsters operated on American soil for over 2 decades, leaving behind a trail of ritualistic murders that would make even seasoned investigators question the very nature of evil itself. His name was Adolfo Constanzo, and he didn't just kill for pleasure or power. He killed because he believed the gods demanded it. In the spring of 1989, a college student named Mark Kilroy vanished during spring break in Matamoros, Mexico, just across the border from Texas. Mark was everything you'd expect from a clean-cut American kid, pre-med student, good family, bright future ahead of him. He'd gone to Mexico with friends for what should have been a typical college party weekend. Instead, he walked into a nightmare that would expose one of the most disturbing cults in modern history. When Mark didn't return to his hotel that night, his friends contacted authorities. The search began immediately, but what they found weeks later defied comprehension. Mark's mutilated body was discovered at a remote ranch outside the city, alongside the remains of 14 other victims. But this wasn't the work of a typical serial killer. The bodies had been arranged in specific patterns, organs removed with surgical precision, and evidence of ritualistic torture was everywhere. The man responsible was Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, a Cuban-American who had transformed himself into something far more sinister than a simple murderer. He was a high priest of his own twisted religion, a charismatic leader who convinced dozens of followers that human sacrifice would grant them supernatural protection and unlimited power. Constanzo was born in Miami in 1962 to a Cuban mother who practiced Santeria, a religion that blends African spiritual traditions with Catholicism. From childhood, Adolfo was immersed in a world of ritual magic, animal sacrifice, and communication with spirits. His mother, Aurora, was a respected practitioner who taught him the fundamentals of the faith. But where traditional Santeria emphasized healing and protection, Adolfo's interpretation became something entirely different. By his teens, Constanzo had already begun experimenting with darker practices. He moved between Miami and Mexico City, studying under various spiritual leaders and absorbing elements from multiple belief systems. He learned about Palo Mayombe, a more aggressive form of Afro-Caribbean magic that sometimes involved grave robbing and the use of human remains. He incorporated aspects of voodoo, black magic, and even elements of Aztec human sacrifice rituals. What made Constanzo truly dangerous wasn't just his knowledge of these practices, it was his ability to convince others that he possessed genuine supernatural powers. He was handsome, articulate, and possessed an almost hypnotic charisma. When he spoke about communicating with spirits or predicting the future, people believed him. And once they believed, he owned them completely. In the early 1980s, Constanzo established himself in Mexico City as a spiritual advisor to wealthy clients. He offered protection spells, fortune-telling, and spiritual cleansing ceremonies. His clientele included politicians, police officers, and drug dealers, people who lived dangerous lives and were willing to pay handsomely for supernatural protection. But behind the legitimate business was something far more sinister. Constanzo had begun forming what he called his inner circle, a group of devoted followers who believed he was a direct conduit to the spirit world. Among them was Sara Aldrade, a Mexican-American college student who became both his lover and his high priestess. Sara was intelligent, educated, and came from a respectable family, but under Constanzo's influence, she transformed into something unrecognizable. The group practiced increasingly extreme rituals. What started as animal sacrifices gradually escalated to grave robbing, where they would steal human remains to create what they called ngangas, cauldrons filled with bones, blood, and other ritual items that were believed to house powerful spirits. But even this wasn't enough for Constanzo. He convinced his followers that to achieve true power, they needed fresh human sacrifice. The first known human victim was probably a transient, someone who wouldn't be missed. Constanzo told his followers that the spirits had chosen this person, that their death would protect the group and grant them supernatural abilities. The ritual was conducted with meticulous care, the victim tortured to increase their spiritual energy before being killed. Body parts were removed and added to the nganga, while the remaining flesh was disposed of in remote locations. What's most disturbing about Constanzo's operation was how systematic it became. This wasn't frenzied killing driven by madness. It was calculated murder conducted like a business. The group kept detailed records of their rituals, including photographs and written accounts of each sacrifice. They had specific procedures for selecting victims, conducting ceremonies, and disposing of evidence. The cult's membership grew to include drug traffickers from the powerful Hernandez family, who controlled smuggling operations along the Texas-Mexico border. These weren't desperate people looking for meaning. They were successful criminals who genuinely believed that Constanzo's rituals made them invincible. They credited him with their ability to avoid arrest, survive rival gang attacks, and successfully transport tons of drugs across the border. In exchange for his protection spells, the drug dealers provided Constanzo with money, weapons, and access to remote locations where rituals could be conducted without interference. They also provided victims. When the group needed someone for sacrifice, the traffickers would simply kidnap whoever Constanzo selected. Sometimes it was a rival gang member, sometimes an informant, and sometimes, like in Mark Kilroy's case, it was completely random. Mark Kilroy was chosen simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. On the night of March 14th, 1989, he was walking near the border when cult members spotted him. They saw a young, healthy American, someone whose sacrifice would provide powerful spiritual energy. Mark was abducted, taken to the ranch, and subjected to horrific torture before being killed in a ritual that lasted several hours. But Mark's disappearance was different from previous victims because his family refused to accept that he had simply vanished. His parents, Jim and Helen Kilroy, flew to Mexico and conducted their own investigation, working with both American and Mexican authorities to keep pressure on the case. The media attention made it impossible for authorities to simply file the case away and forget about it. The investigation led police to the Hernandez drug organization, and from there to the remote ranch where the cult conducted its rituals. What they found there was beyond anything they had prepared for. The main building contained multiple ngangas filled with human remains, blood-stained altars, and ritual implements. The walls were covered with symbols and photographs documenting years of human sacrifice. In the backyard, investigators discovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 15 people, including Mark Kilroy. Many of the bodies showed signs of prolonged torture. Organs had been removed while the victims were still alive, and some had been partially cannibalized as part of the ritual process. The crime scene was so disturbing that several officers had to be relieved from duty. When authorities closed in on the cult, most members were arrested without resistance, but Constanzo refused to surrender. In a final act of defiance, he ordered one of his followers to kill him rather than face capture. He died in a shootout in Mexico City, still convinced that his death would transform him into a more powerful spirit. The trial of the surviving cult members revealed the full scope of the organization's activities. Sarah Aldrete and several others were convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The drug trafficking operation was dismantled and the ranch was destroyed, but questions remained about how many other victims there might have been and whether other similar groups were operating elsewhere. What made Constanzo's cult particularly terrifying was how it combined religious fanaticism with organized crime. These weren't desperate people seeking meaning. They were successful individuals who genuinely believed that murder would grant them supernatural advantages. The cult attracted educated, wealthy followers who saw human sacrifice as a business investment, a way to guarantee success in their criminal enterprises. The psychological manipulation Constanzo employed was sophisticated and calculated. He understood exactly how to identify people's deepest fears and desires, then position himself as the solution to their problems. He offered protection to those who lived dangerous lives, power to those who felt powerless, and spiritual meaning to those searching for purpose. Once someone accepted his worldview, they became completely dependent on his guidance. The Matamoros cold case exposed the dark intersection between organized crime and religious extremism, showing how charismatic leaders can exploit both spiritual hunger and criminal ambition to create something truly monstrous. It revealed how easily ordinary people can be transformed into willing participants in the most horrific acts when they believe those acts serve a higher purpose. Adolfo Constanzo died believing he was a messenger of the gods, a powerful sorcerer whose rituals had granted him supernatural abilities. In reality, he was a manipulative predator who used religious beliefs as a weapon to control others and justify his own sadistic impulses. His legacy isn't one of spiritual power, but of how easily faith can be corrupted and weaponized by those who understand human psychology. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of young people like Mark Kilroy, who become targets simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mark's death wasn't the result of any choice he made or lifestyle he lived. He was killed because a group of fanatics believed his murder would bring them good fortune. In the mountains of Northern California, surrounded by dense forests and crystal clear lakes, the landscape seems almost too perfect to hide the darkness that once festered there. But in the early 1980s, this serene wilderness became the backdrop for crimes so depraved, so methodically evil, that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they uncovered. Two men, bound together by a shared appetite for absolute control and unthinkable cruelty, turned a remote cabin into a chamber of horrors that would challenge everything we thought we knew about human evil. Leonard Lake was born in 1945 in San Francisco, but his childhood was anything but ordinary. Raised primarily by his grandmother after his parents' tumultuous relationship fell apart, Lake exhibited disturbing behaviors from an early age. He collected mice, not as pets, but to watch them die. He would place them in jars, seal the lids tight, and observe their final moments with clinical fascination. When other children played with toys, Lake was experimenting with death, learning the mechanics of control over life itself. By his teenage years, Lake had developed an obsession with survivalism and apocalyptic fantasies. He devoured books about nuclear war, government collapse, and end times scenarios. But these weren't fears for Lake, they were hopes. He dreamed of a world where civilization crumbled and only the strongest, the most prepared would survive. In his twisted mind, he saw himself as one of those survivors, ruling over whatever remained with absolute authority. Lake's military service in Vietnam seemed to offer an outlet for his violent tendencies, but records show he never saw combat. Instead, he worked as a radar operator, far from the front lines. This mundane reality didn't fit his self-constructed image as a warrior, so he began fabricating stories about his service, claiming to have been a special forces operative who had witnessed and participated in unspeakable acts of violence. The lies became so elaborate, so detailed, that even he seemed to believe them. After his discharge, Lake drifted through various jobs and relationships, but nothing could contain the darkness growing inside him. He became obsessed with pornography, particularly violent and degrading material. He began filming his own sexual encounters without consent, treating women not as human beings, but as objects to be used and discarded. His first marriage ended when his wife discovered his collection of illegal photographs and films. His second marriage followed the same pattern: violence, control, and eventual abandonment. His plan was simple in concept, but horrifying in execution. He would build a compound in the wilderness where he could keep women as sex slaves, breeding them like cattle to repopulate the earth after the coming apocalypse. To Lake, this wasn't a fantasy, it was destiny. In 1981, Lake purchased a remote cabin in Calaveras County, California. The property was perfect for his purposes, isolated, surrounded by thick forest, and miles from the nearest neighbor. He began constructing what appeared to be a simple bunker for storing supplies, but the reality was far more sinister. Hidden beneath the innocent exterior was a soundproof chamber designed specifically for torture and imprisonment. Lake's dungeon was a masterpiece of calculated evil. The walls were lined with soundproofing material to muffle screams. Heavy steel doors sealed victims inside. Chains and restraints were bolted to the walls. Video cameras were positioned to record everything that happened inside. This wasn't the impulsive creation of a madman, it was the carefully planned workshop of a predator who had spent years thinking about exactly how to maximize human suffering. But Lake needed help to fully realize his vision, and that's where Charles Ng entered the picture. Charles Chi-Tat Ng was born in Hong Kong in 1960 to a wealthy family. His father was a successful businessman who demanded perfection from his son, often using brutal physical punishment to enforce discipline. Unji's childhood was marked by constant fear, humiliation, and rage. Unlike Lake's gradual descent into darkness, Ng's violence seemed to emerge fully formed, as if cruelty was simply his natural state. As a teenager, Ng was expelled from multiple schools for theft, violence, and disturbing behavior toward other students. His parents, desperate to control their increasingly dangerous son, sent him to boarding school in England. But the change of scenery did nothing to curb his appetites. Ng continued stealing, fighting, and displaying the cold indifference to others' suffering that would define his entire life. In 1979, Ng immigrated to the United States and enlisted in the Marine Corps, perhaps hoping that military discipline would provide the structure he seemed to lack. Instead, it gave him access to weapons and training that would make him even more dangerous. Ng excelled at combat training, learning advanced techniques for inflicting pain and death. But his criminal behavior continued. He was caught stealing weapons from the base armory and selling them on the black market. Facing court-martial and likely imprisonment, Ung deserted from the Marines and went into hiding. It was during this period of desperation that he encountered Leonard Lake, and the two men recognized something kindred in each other. Lake saw in Ung a willing partner who shared his appetite for violence and control. Ung saw in Lake an older, more experienced predator who could teach him new ways to satisfy his darkest urges. Together, they were far more dangerous than either had been alone. Lake and Ung's partnership began with petty crimes, theft, fraud, and small-time drug dealing. But these were just practice runs, ways to test each other's loyalty and commitment to their shared vision. Lake introduced Ung to his Miranda project, and Ung embraced it with enthusiasm. Here was someone who not only understood his violent fantasies, but had created a concrete plan to make them reality. The two men began hunting together, but their prey wasn't animals, it was human beings. They targeted people who wouldn't be missed quickly: runaways, drifters, individuals living on the margins of society. They also preyed on entire families, luring them to the remote cabin with promises of work or friendship, only to murder the men and children while keeping the women alive for prolonged torture. Their method was devastatingly efficient. Lake would use his charm and apparent respectability to gain victims' trust. He was articulate, well-read, and could present himself as a successful businessman or helpful neighbor. Once victims were isolated at the cabin, Ung would emerge, and their true nature would be revealed. The men and children were killed quickly, usually with gunshots to the head. The women faced a far worse fate. Lake had constructed his torture chamber with meticulous attention to detail. Victims were chained to the walls, unable to move or escape. They were subjected to prolonged sexual assault, physical torture, and psychological torment. Lake and Ung filmed everything, creating a library of suffering that they would watch repeatedly, reliving their crimes over and over again. But the torture served a purpose beyond mere sadism. Lake and Ung were attempting to break their victims completely, to destroy their sense of self until they became compliant slaves. They would force women to write letters to family members, claiming they had left voluntarily and didn't want to be contacted. They would make them participate in degrading acts while being filmed, creating blackmail material to ensure compliance. The psychological torture was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. Lake would tell victims in detail how their family members had been killed, describing the fear in their children's eyes as they died. He would promise freedom if they cooperated, then reveal it was a lie. He would alternate between apparent kindness and explosive violence, keeping victims in a constant state of terror and confusion. For months, this nightmare continued in the isolated cabin. Lake and Ung refined their techniques, experimented with different forms of torture, and documented everything with the detached interest of scientists conducting research. They weren't driven by passion or rage. They approached their crimes with cold calculation, always seeking new ways to maximize their victims' suffering. The exact number of their victims may never be known, but investigators believe Lake and Ung were responsible for at least 12 murders, possibly many more. Entire families vanished without a trace. Missing person reports piled up in police files, but with no bodies and no witnesses, there was little authorities could do. The killing spree might have continued indefinitely, if not for a seemingly minor incident that brought everything crashing down. In June 1985, Ng was caught shoplifting at a hardware store in San Francisco. When police arrived, they found Lake waiting in a car outside. Lake's behavior was nervous, still evasive, and when officers ran the license plates, they discovered the car was registered to a man named Paul Cosner, who had been reported missing. During questioning, Lake initially gave false identification, but when his real identity was discovered, investigators found an outstanding warrant for his arrest. Faced with the prospect of prison and the likely discovery of his crimes, Lake made a final decision. He had hidden a cyanide capsule in his jacket, and while sitting in the police station, he bit down on it and died within minutes. Lake's suicide only deepened the mystery. Police had no idea why he had chosen death over arrest, but a search of the cabin property would soon reveal the horrific truth. What they found there defied comprehension. Human remains scattered across the property, personal belongings from dozens of missing persons, and most damning of all, hours of videotaped torture sessions. The videos were the most disturbing evidence investigators had ever encountered. They showed Lake and Ng systematically torturing their victims, alternating between sexual assault and psychological torment. In one particularly chilling segment, Lake addresses a victim directly, explaining in calm, measured tones exactly what he plans to do to her and why she should accept her fate. His voice is almost hypnotic, like a teacher explaining a lesson to a student. Charles Ng, meanwhile, had fled to Canada after Lake's arrest. He lived as a fugitive for several years, working odd jobs and avoiding detection. But his violent nature couldn't be contained, and in 1985, he was arrested in Calgary after shooting a security guard during a robbery attempt. When his true identity was discovered, American authorities began extradition proceedings. Ng's legal battle to avoid extradition lasted for 6 years. He hired teams of lawyers, filed countless appeals, and used every legal maneuver available to avoid facing trial in the United States. His primary argument was that he faced the death penalty in California, which he claimed violated his human rights. The irony was lost on no one here, was a man who had tortured innocent people to death, now claiming his own rights were being violated. Eventually, in 1991, Ng was extradited to California to face trial. The proceedings were a media circus, with every detail of the Lake Ng crimes splashed across newspaper headlines. The evidence was overwhelming. Police had found the bodies, the torture chamber, the videos, and personal belongings from dozens of victims. Ng's defense team tried to argue that he was merely Lake's accomplice, that the older man had been the true mastermind behind the crimes. But the videos told a different story. They showed Ng actively participating in the torture, clearly enjoying the suffering he was inflicting. In one segment, he taunts a victim who is begging for her life, laughing at her desperation. In another, he explains to the camera his philosophy about women, describing them as objects to be used and discarded at will. The trial lasted for years, with Ng's lawyers using every possible delay tactic to postpone the inevitable verdict. Ng himself seemed to enjoy the attention, the chance to be the center of a media spectacle. He would smile for cameras, make cryptic statements to reporters, and generally behave as if the entire proceeding was entertainment designed for his benefit. In 1999, 14 years after Lake's suicide, Charles Ng was finally convicted on 11 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Ung showed no remorse, no recognition of the suffering he had caused. Even when faced with the ultimate punishment, he remained cold, calculating, and utterly indifferent to human life. Today, Charles Ung sits on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he has been for over 2 decades. He rarely grants interviews, never expresses remorse, and continues to maintain his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The appeals process continues, meaning he may never actually face execution. The cabin where Lake and Ung committed their crimes has been demolished, but the site remains a source of fascination for those drawn to dark history. The surrounding forest has reclaimed much of the property, as if nature itself is trying to heal the wounds inflicted there. But for the families of the victims, for the investigators who worked the case, and for anyone who has studied these crimes, the memory of what happened in that remote corner of California will never fade. The partnership between Leonard Lake and Charles Ung represents something uniquely terrifying in the annals of criminal history. These weren't crimes of passion, desperation, or even traditional greed. They were the methodical, calculated actions of two men who had decided that other human beings existed solely for their pleasure and convenience. They created a system designed to maximize suffering, refined it through practice, and documented it for their own entertainment. What makes their story even more disturbing is how ordinary they appeared to those who knew them casually. Lake was articulate, well-read, and could discuss philosophy, literature, and current events with apparent intelligence. Ung was quiet but polite, the kind of person who might work in your office or live in your neighborhood without raising any suspicion. They wore masks of normalcy while planning and executing acts of unimaginable evil. The Lake Ung case reminds us that monsters don't always look like monsters. They don't announce their intentions or wear their evil on their sleeves. Sometimes they're patient, methodical, and terrifyingly good at blending into ordinary society while nurturing fantasies that would horrify anyone with a functioning conscience. These cases reveal something deeply unsettling about the nature of evil. It's not always loud, dramatic, or obvious. Sometimes it wears a nurse's uniform. Sometimes it drives a taxi through Sao Paulo's streets. Sometimes it runs a bakery in Anchorage. Sometimes it leads a religious cult. And sometimes it builds a bunker in the California mountains. What makes these killers particularly chilling is how they exploited the very systems designed to protect us. Jane Toppen turned healing into harm. Francisco de Assis Pereira weaponized dreams and aspirations. Robert Hansen used the wilderness as his personal hunting ground. Adolfo Constanzo corrupted faith and spirituality. Leonard Lake and Charles Ung turned technology into an instrument of torture. But perhaps what's most disturbing is how long they operated undetected. Toppen killed for years while being praised as a caring nurse. Pereira murdered at least 9 women before anyone connected the dots. Hansen's killing spree lasted over a decade. Constanzo's cult operated openly, mixing with celebrities and politicians. Lake and Ung's operation went on for months, possibly years, in plain sight. These weren't random acts of violence. They were systematic, calculated, and methodical. Each killer developed their own twisted methodology, their own signature, their own way of satisfying their darkest impulses. They studied their victims, learned their weaknesses, and exploited every vulnerability they could find. Jane Toppen didn't just kill patients, she experimented on them like lab rats, watching their vital signs as she slowly poisoned them. She took detailed mental notes about their reactions, their fear, their final moments. To her, every death was a learning experience, a chance to perfect her technique. She claimed the act gave her sexual pleasure, describing the sensation of controlling someone's transition from life to death as the ultimate intimate experience. Francisco de Assis Pereira didn't randomly attack women. He specifically targeted those with modeling aspirations, young women desperate for their big break. He understood their psychology, their dreams, their willingness to take risks for a chance at success. He crafted elaborate lies about photo shoots and magazine covers, painting vivid pictures of the fame and fortune that awaited them. His victims weren't just people to him, they were performers in his twisted fantasy. Robert Hansen's methodology was perhaps the most terrifying of all. He didn't just kill women, he hunted them like animals. He would fly them to remote locations, release them into the wilderness, and then track them down with a hunting rifle. He kept detailed maps marking where each body was buried, like a hunter keeping track of his trophies. To him, human beings were just another species to be conquered and collected. Adolfo Constanzo combined the worst elements of organized crime with the darkest aspects of religious fanaticism. He convinced his followers that human sacrifice would grant them supernatural protection, that the blood of innocents would make them invisible to police and bulletproof against rivals. He turned murder into a sacrament, torture into a prayer, and death into a pathway to power. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng created what can only be described as a factory of human suffering. They didn't just kill their victims, they systematically broke them down, physically and psychologically. They filmed everything, creating a library of human degradation that they could watch and rewatch at their leisure. Their bunker wasn't just a crime scene, it was a monument to their complete contempt for human dignity. What's particularly chilling is how these killers viewed their victims. They didn't see human beings with families, dreams, fears, and hopes. They saw objects, tools, entertainment. Jane Toppen saw test subjects. Francisco saw props for his fantasy. Hansen saw prey. Constanzo saw offerings to dark gods. Lake and Ng saw playthings for their amusement. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal common threads that run through many serial offenders. They all displayed an extraordinary ability to compartmentalize their lives. They could commit horrific acts of violence and then return to their normal routines as if nothing had happened. They were master manipulators, able to present themselves as trustworthy, helpful, even charming when the situation required it. They also shared an almost supernatural ability to identify vulnerable victims. Toppen targeted the sick and dying, people who were already weakened and dependent on her care. Pereira preyed on young women hungry for success, willing to trust a stranger who promised to make their dreams come true. Hansen focused on sex workers and dancers, women who were often estranged from their families and whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed. Constanzo recruited followers who were searching for meaning, purpose, and belonging. Lake and Ng targeted entire families, people who were isolated and unlikely to be missed quickly. The investigation and capture of these killers often revealed shocking oversights by law enforcement and society as a whole. Warning signs were missed, patterns went unrecognized, and victims' concerns were dismissed. In many cases, If authorities had acted more quickly or taken early reports more seriously, lives could have been saved. Jane Toppen's colleagues noticed her patients died at unusually high rates, but attributed it to bad luck rather than foul play. Francisco de Assis Pereira was questioned multiple times about missing women, but released due to lack of evidence. Robert Hansen was investigated for assault and kidnapping, but the charges were dropped when victims refused to testify. Adolfo Constanzo operated his cult openly, with neighbors hearing screams and seeing suspicious activity but failing to report it. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng's operation was only discovered by accident when Lake was caught shoplifting. These cases force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the society we live in. They reveal how easy it is for predators to hide in plain sight, how our trust in institutions and authority figures can be exploited, and how quickly the vulnerable can become victims when no one is watching. But perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that evil is not some abstract concept or distant threat. It walks among us, works beside us, and sometimes even cares for us. It wears familiar faces and speaks in soothing voices. It promises help, offers opportunities, and provides comfort. And then, when we least expect it, it reveals its true nature. The legacy of these killers extends far beyond their immediate victims. They shattered families, traumatized communities, and forever changed how we think about trust and safety. They forced us to acknowledge that the monsters we fear are not hiding under our beds or lurking in dark alleys. They're in our hospitals, driving our taxis, running our businesses, leading our congregations, and living in our neighborhoods. Understanding these cases is not about satisfying morbid curiosity or sensationalizing violence. It's about recognizing the warning signs, protecting the vulnerable, and ensuring that such horrors are never repeated. We've journeyed through the twisted minds of 5 serial killers who operated in the shadows, exploiting the very systems designed to protect us. But understanding their methods, their motivations, and their horrifying success raises uncomfortable questions about our society itself. What does it tell us about human nature when monsters can hide so effectively behind masks of normalcy? Jane Toppen didn't just kill patients, she perverted the sacred trust between healer and vulnerable. Her white uniform became a predator's disguise, her medical knowledge a weapon more deadly than any blade. She understood that people don't question authority figures, especially those sworn to help. That blind trust became her hunting ground. Francisco de Assis Pereira weaponized hope itself. He knew that desperate people would believe almost anything if it promised a better future. His victims weren't just killed, they were betrayed by their own dreams. He turned their ambitions into traps, their hopes into death sentences. The modeling industry's glamorous facade provided perfect cover for his predatory nature. Robert Hansen transformed Alaska's wilderness into his personal killing field. He exploited both geography and society's indifference toward certain victims. The vast emptiness of the frontier meant bodies could disappear forever, while society's dismissal of sex workers meant their disappearances barely registered. Hansen understood that isolation breeds invisibility. Adolfo Constanzo created a perfect storm of manipulation, combining religious fervor with criminal enterprise. He didn't just kill, he convinced others that murder was sacred duty. His victims died not just from violence, but from the perversion of faith itself. He proved that when people surrender their moral judgment to a charismatic leader, any atrocity becomes possible. Leonard Lake and Charles Ung represent perhaps the most chilling evolution of evil, the systematic industrialization of torture and murder. They didn't just kill impulsively, they created an entire infrastructure of death. Their bunker wasn't just a crime scene, it was a factory of human suffering. They documented their crimes not from paranoia, but from pride, treating murder like a hobby to be savored and remembered. These killers succeeded because they understood something fundamental about human psychology. We want to trust. We want to believe that doctors heal, that opportunity knocks, that wilderness is peaceful, that faith provides comfort, that neighbors are harmless. Our natural inclination toward trust, toward hope, toward community became their greatest weapons. But their success also reveals systemic failures that persist today. Medical oversight was inadequate, allowing Toppen to kill for years. Economic desperation made Pereira's victims vulnerable to exploitation. Law enforcement dismissed Hansen's victims as disposable. Religious manipulation went unchecked in Constanzo's case, and technology that could have exposed Lake and Ung instead enabled their crimes. Each of these killers operated during periods of social transition. Toppen worked when medical professionalization was incomplete. Pereira exploited Brazil's economic upheaval. Hansen thrived during Alaska's boom years when oversight was minimal. Constanzo capitalized on drug war chaos. Lake and Ung emerged during the early days of home video technology. What's most disturbing isn't just their individual depravity, but how their crimes exposed broader vulnerabilities in our social fabric. They succeeded because institutions failed, because prejudices blinded authorities, because isolation enabled predators, because technology outpaced ethics. These weren't supernatural monsters or Hollywood villains. They were ordinary people who chose extraordinary evil. They held jobs, maintained relationships, participated in communities. They smiled at neighbors, paid taxes, followed traffic laws. Their ordinariness wasn't camouflage, it was genuine. Evil doesn't announce itself with dramatic music and ominous lighting. It arrives quietly, politely, wearing a familiar face. The victims of these killers weren't just statistics. They were daughters and sons, mothers and fathers, dreamers and survivors. Toppen's patients trusted her with their lives. Pereira's victims trusted him with their futures. Hansen's victims trusted him with their safety. Constanzo's followers trusted him with their souls. Lake and Ung's victims trusted them with their families. Perhaps most haunting of all, these killers might still be operating today, evolved and adapted to new technologies and social structures. The same vulnerabilities they exploited, the same human weaknesses they preyed upon, the same institutional failures they navigated, all still exist in different forms. The internet has created new opportunities for predators to identify and manipulate victims. Social media provides unprecedented access to personal information. Economic inequality creates new forms of desperation. Political polarization enables new forms of manipulation. And our increasing isolation makes us more vulnerable to those who would exploit our loneliness. But understanding these cases also reveals our capacity for resilience and justice. Eventually, each of these killers was caught, not by superhuman investigators, but by ordinary people doing their jobs. Nurses who noticed patterns, detectives who followed leads, survivors who spoke truth, communities that refused to forget. Their stories remind us that evil succeeds when good people do nothing, when institutions fail their purpose, when society abandons its most vulnerable members. But they also remind us that justice is possible, that truth can emerge from darkness, that remembering victims honors their lives while warning future generations. These five killers represent different faces of the same fundamental evil, the decision to treat other human beings as objects to be used and discarded. They remind us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance, not just against external threats, but against the monsters that can emerge from within our own communities. In studying their crimes, we don't celebrate their evil, but seek to understand it, to recognize its warning signs, to protect future victims. Their stories are horror stories, but they're also cautionary tales about the world we've built and the world we must strive to create. The most evil serial killers you've never heard of succeeded because they understood human nature better than their victims understood theirs. They exploited our trust, our hope, our faith, our isolation. But in remembering their victims and understanding their methods, we honor the dead while protecting the living. The hunt for Leonard Lake began on June the 2nd, 1985, when a San Francisco police officer noticed something suspicious. A bearded man in his 40s was walking out of a hardware store, casually carrying a bench vise. The problem was, he hadn't paid for it. When the officer approached, the man seemed calm, almost friendly. He handed over a driver's license with the name Robin Scott Stapley and smiled like this was all just a misunderstanding. But something felt wrong. The officer ran the name through the system and discovered that Robin Scott Stapley was a missing person, reported vanished months earlier. When confronted with this information, the man who claimed to be Stapley did something that stunned everyone present. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small capsule, bit down on it, and swallowed. Within minutes, he was convulsing on the ground, foam spilling from his mouth. He had taken cyanide. His real name was Leonard Lake, and his death was just the beginning of one of the most horrifying discoveries in American criminal history. The car Lake had been driving led police to an address in the remote hills of Calaveras County, California. What they found there defied comprehension. A modest cabin sat on 45 acres of wilderness, isolated and hidden from view. But it wasn't the cabin that held the horror, it was what lay beneath it. In the backyard, investigators discovered a concrete bunker partially buried and reinforced with steel. Inside was a chamber of systematic torture, complete with restraints, cameras, and recording equipment. This wasn't the work of a madman acting on impulse. This was organized, calculated evil. The bunker contained dozens of videotapes, and what was recorded on them remains some of the most disturbing evidence ever collected by law enforcement. The tapes showed women and children being tortured, humiliated, and murdered in methodical detail. Lake and his partner, Charles Ung, had been documenting their crimes like they were creating instructional videos. They called their operation Operation Miranda, named after a character from Shakespeare's The Tempest, a woman isolated and controlled by powerful men. The parallel was intentional and chilling. Leonard Lake was born in 1945 in San Francisco, but his childhood was marked by dysfunction and early signs of the darkness that would later consume him. His parents divorced when he was young, and he was raised primarily by his grandmother, who was strict and emotionally distant. By his teenage years, Lake was already showing disturbing behaviors. He collected mice and other small animals, not as pets, but to torture and kill them. He photographed the process, developing an early fascination with documenting suffering. Lake served 2 tours in Vietnam as a radar operator, though he never saw combat. He used his military experience to construct an elaborate fantasy about himself as a hardened warrior, but those who served with him described him as quiet, strange, and obsessed with survivalist ideology. When he returned to civilian life, he became increasingly paranoid about nuclear war and societal collapse. He stockpiled weapons, food, and supplies, convinced that civilization was on the brink of destruction. But his preparations weren't just about survival, they were about control. In the late 1970s, Lake met Charles Ng, a young man whose capacity for cruelty matched his own. Ng was born in Hong Kong in 1960 and had been in trouble with the law from an early age. He had been kicked out of several schools for theft and violence, and his family eventually sent him to England, hoping a change of environment might help. Instead, Ng's behavior worsened. He was arrested for shoplifting and burglary, and when he turned 18, he fled to the United States to avoid prosecution. Ng enlisted in the Marine Corps, but his military career was short-lived. He was caught stealing weapons from the base armory and sentenced to 3 years in military prison. He escaped during a work detail and disappeared into the underground. It was during this time that he met Leonard Lake, and their partnership would prove to be one of the most deadly combinations in criminal history. Their goal was to create the perfect slaves, women who would be completely broken down and rebuilt to serve their every desire. They believed that society was weak and that they were superior beings destined to survive the coming apocalypse. In their minds, they were preparing for a future where they would rule over a collection of enslaved women who would cook, clean, and submit to their sexual demands without question. The bunker they constructed was designed specifically for this purpose. It contained cells where victims were held, a main room equipped with cameras and recording equipment, and a workshop where they disposed of bodies. The entire facility was soundproofed and hidden from view. They had created their own private hell, and they documented every moment of it. Their victims were chosen carefully. They targeted people who wouldn't be missed quickly, drifters, runaways, and those living on the margins of society. But they also went after families, entire households that they would eliminate to steal identities and property. One of their most horrific crimes involved the murder of Harvey Dubbs, his wife Deborah, and their 16-month-old son Sean. Lake and Ng killed Harvey immediately, but they kept Deborah alive for weeks, torturing her while forcing her to care for her baby. The videotapes show her begging for her child's life, promising to do anything they asked if they would just let Sean go. They killed them both anyway. The scope of their crimes was staggering. Police found evidence linking them to at least 25 murders, though the true number is likely much higher. They had been operating for years, perfecting their methods and expanding their operation. Lake kept detailed journals describing their activities, written in a cold, clinical style that showed no remorse or recognition of his victims' humanity. To him, they were objects, things to be used and discarded. When investigators searched the property, they found bone fragments scattered throughout the grounds. Some had been burned in a custom-built incinerator that Lake had constructed specifically for disposing of bodies. Others were buried in shallow graves or fed to pigs that Lake kept on the property. The systematic nature of the disposal process showed that this wasn't random violence. It was an industrial operation designed to eliminate evidence. Charles Ung had fled to Canada after Lake's arrest, but he was eventually captured and extradited to California. His trial became one of the longest and most expensive in California history, lasting over 4 years. Ung showed no remorse throughout the proceedings, often smiling and joking with his attorneys, while families of the victims wept in the gallery. He was eventually convicted of 11 murders and sentenced to death, though he remains on death row decades later, still filing appeals and refusing to acknowledge his crimes. The Lake and Ung case revealed something terrifying about human nature, that evil can be organized, systematic, and sustained over years. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were the calculated actions of men who had completely divorced themselves from human empathy. They had created their own world where other people existed only to serve their desires, and they documented their atrocities with the same care that others might use to record family vacations. What makes their story even more disturbing is how ordinary they appeared to those who knew them casually. Lake was described by neighbors as quiet and polite, a man who kept to himself but was always friendly when encountered. He ran a small business and seemed to live a normal life. Ingi was more volatile, but even he could be charming when it suited his purposes. They hid their true nature behind masks of normalcy, and that deception allowed them to continue their crimes for years. The psychological profiles developed after their capture revealed men who saw themselves as superior to everyone around them. They believed that conventional morality didn't apply to them, that they were entitled to take whatever they wanted from whomever they chose. This sense of entitlement, combined with their complete lack of empathy, created monsters who could torture and kill without hesitation or regret. The investigation into their crimes continued for years after Lake's death and Ung's capture. Families of missing persons would come forward, hoping for answers about loved ones who had vanished. Some found closure, others never learned the truth. The bunker was eventually filled in and the property sold, but the memory of what happened there lingers like a stain that can never be completely washed away. Today, the case serves as a reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight, how systems of trust and social convention can be exploited by those who see other human beings as nothing more than objects for their gratification. Lake and Ung didn't kill in rage or desperation. They killed because they enjoyed it, because they could, and because they believed they had the right to do so. What emerges from these cases isn't just a catalog of horrors, but a blueprint of how evil operates in plain sight. Each of these killers succeeded not through supernatural cunning, but by exploiting the fundamental blind spots of civilization itself. Jane Toppen wielded a nurse's uniform like armor, transforming medicine's most sacred trust into a weapon. Francisco de Assis Pereira turned dreams into nightmares, weaponizing hope against the desperate. Robert Hansen used Alaska's wilderness as his personal hunting ground, knowing the vast emptiness would swallow his crimes whole. Adolfo Constanzo merged faith with violence, creating a twisted theology where murder became worship. Leonard Lake and Charles Ung built their factory of death in suburban California, proving that the most monstrous evil can flourish behind white picket fences. The terrifying truth is that none of these monsters were supernatural beings. They were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices to embrace darkness. They walked among us, worked beside us, smiled at us in grocery stores and gas stations. They understood something that most of us refuse to acknowledge: that society runs on trust, and trust can be weaponized by those willing to shatter it. Jane Toppen's victims trusted her because she wore scrubs. They believed the medical system would protect them, that a woman's gentle touch meant safety. She exploited not just their physical vulnerability, but their psychological need to believe in healing. Every injection she administered was a betrayal of thousands of years of medical tradition, yet she did it with a smile, collecting their final moments like trophies. Francisco de Assis Pereira's victims trusted him because he offered them what they desperately wanted: a chance at stardom, an escape from poverty, a glimpse of the glamorous life they'd only seen in magazines. He understood that desperation makes people vulnerable, that hope can blind victims to danger. He didn't need to force his victims into his car. He made them want to get in. Robert Hansen's victims were invisible to society, discarded by a world that saw sex workers as expendable. He exploited not just their physical isolation, but their social isolation. He knew that when they disappeared, the investigation would be half-hearted at best. He turned society's prejudice into his hunting license, using our collective indifference as camouflage for his crimes. Adolfo Constanzo's followers trusted him because he offered them power, protection, and purpose. He understood that humans are wired to seek meaning, to believe in something greater than themselves. He twisted that fundamental need into a justification for unspeakable acts, proving that faith without wisdom becomes fanaticism, and fanaticism can justify anything. Leonard Lake and Charles Ung succeeded because they looked like everyone else. Lake was a survivalist, the kind of guy who might help you change a tire or lend you tools. He seemed like a quiet immigrant trying to make his way in America. They understood that the best hiding place for monsters is in the crowd, that normalcy is the perfect disguise for abnormality. These cases reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and society. We want to believe that evil announces itself, that monsters look like monsters, that warning signs are obvious and systems work. But these killers prove otherwise. They show us that evil often wears a friendly face, that our institutions can be corrupted from within, that the very qualities that make us human, trust, hope, faith, community, can be turned against us by those who understand our weaknesses better than we understand theirs. The most chilling aspect isn't their body counts or their methods, but their patience. Jane Toppen killed for decades. Francisco hunted for years. Hansen operated for over a decade. Constanzo built his cult slowly, methodically. Lake and Ung planned their operation like a business venture. They weren't impulsive killers, striking in moments of rage. They were calculating predators who understood that the best way to avoid detection is to become indispensable, invisible, or irrelevant to those around you. These monsters succeeded because they understood us better than we understood them. They studied human psychology not to heal or help, but to hunt and harm. They recognized that every strength contains a weakness. Every virtue can become a vulnerability. Every system designed to protect can be subverted to destroy. The legacy of these killers isn't just the lives they took, but the trust they shattered, the innocence they destroyed, the faith they corrupted. They proved that evil doesn't need fangs or claws to be deadly. It just needs patience, cunning, and an understanding of human nature's darkest possibilities. Their crimes serve as a reminder that vigilance isn't paranoia, that healthy skepticism isn't cynicism, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look exactly like prey. In the end, these 5 cases force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. The monsters we fear most aren't hiding in shadows or haunting abandoned buildings. They're sitting in the cubicle next to us, serving us coffee, treating our illnesses, or living in the house down the street. What makes these killers so disturbing isn't just the magnitude of their crimes, but the systematic nature of their evil. Each one of them reveals something deeper about the human capacity for darkness and about the systems that failed to stop them. Jane Toppen didn't just kill her patients, she turned healing into a laboratory of death. She exploited the most fundamental trust between caregiver and patient, transforming moments of vulnerability into opportunities for experimentation. Her crimes reveal how easily institutions can be manipulated when we assume good intentions. She operated for years in plain sight because nobody questioned the gentle nurse who stayed so late with the dying. Francisco de Assis Pereira weaponized hope itself. He understood exactly what young women dreamed of in Brazil's harsh social landscape, and he turned those dreams into traps. His methodology was chillingly simple. Identify the vulnerable, promise them everything they wanted, then destroy them. What's most disturbing is how he could have continued indefinitely if not for one woman's courage to escape and speak out. How many others like him are still out there using the same tactics? Robert Hansen created his own twisted version of the American frontier myth. He turned Alaska's wilderness into his personal hunting preserve, treating human beings like animals. His crimes expose how geographic isolation can become a weapon in the hands of predators. The vast emptiness that drew people to Alaska for freedom became their prison. Hansen understood that landscape could be an accomplice, that distance could silence screams. Adolfo Constanzo merged religious fanaticism with organized crime in ways that still chill law enforcement. He didn't just kill people, he convinced others that killing was holy. His ability to blend genuine religious practices with horrific violence created a system where murder became worship. The most terrifying aspect wasn't just his personal brutality, but his capacity to make others complicit in it. He built a machine of death that operated through faith. Leonard Lake and Charles Ung created something unprecedented, a factory of human suffering. Their compound wasn't just a place where crimes happened, it was designed specifically to maximize terror and control. They documented everything, turning their victims' final moments into entertainment. Their partnership reveals how evil can be amplified when like-minded predators find each other. Lake's planning combined with Ung's sadism created something worse than either could have achieved alone. These cases share disturbing patterns that we ignore at our peril. Each killer exploited positions of trust or authority. Toppen used her medical credentials, Pereira posed as a modeling scout, Hansen seemed like a respected businessman, Constanzo claimed religious authority, and Lake and Ung created false identities to lure victims. They understood that people want to trust, want to believe in good intentions, and they weaponized that basic human instinct. They all targeted society's most vulnerable populations. Toppen killed the elderly and sick. Pereira preyed on poor young women. Hansen hunted sex workers and runaways. Constanzo recruited desperate followers. And Lake and Ung selected people who wouldn't be missed quickly. This wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. They knew that crimes against the marginalized receive less attention, fewer resources, and generate less public outrage. Perhaps most chilling is how they hid in plain sight. None of them looked like monsters. They were the helpful nurse, the smooth-talking talent scout, the quiet local businessman, the charismatic religious leader, the eccentric survivalists. They understood that evil's greatest disguise is normalcy. They counted on our reluctance to believe that ordinary-seeming people could harbor such darkness. Their crimes also reveal institutional failures that persist today. Medical oversight that relied too heavily on trust, law enforcement that didn't take crimes against sex workers seriously enough, immigration systems that couldn't track dangerous individuals, communities that ignored warning signs because they seemed too extreme to be real. These weren't just individual monsters, they were products of systemic vulnerabilities that remain largely unaddressed. What's most disturbing is how long they operated undetected. Toppen killed for over a decade. Pereira's spree lasted years. Hansen hunted for more than a decade. Constanzo built his cult gradually over years, and Lake and Ung perfected their system over extended periods. They had time to refine their methods, to learn from mistakes, to become more efficient at causing suffering. Each successful crime made them bolder and more dangerous. The psychological profiles reveal another unsettling truth. None of them showed traditional signs of mental illness that would have triggered intervention. They were organized, methodical, and completely aware of their actions. They made conscious choices to embrace evil, and they were intelligent enough to avoid detection. This challenges our comfortable assumptions about criminal behavior and forces us to confront the possibility that some people simply choose to be monsters. Their stories matter because they're not historical curiosities, they're warnings. The same vulnerabilities they exploited still exist today. The same institutional blind spots persist. The same human tendency to trust authority figures and ignore warning signs continues to make us vulnerable to predators who understand how to manipulate these weaknesses. We tell ourselves that we'd recognize such evil if we encountered it, but these cases prove otherwise. Evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears scrubs and speaks softly to patients. Sometimes it carries business cards and makes promises about fame. Sometimes it owns local businesses and seems like a pillar of the community. Sometimes it preaches about salvation while planning damnation. Sometimes it builds bunkers and talks about self-reliance while planning the ultimate violation of others' freedom. The most important lesson from these forgotten killers isn't about the past, it's about the present. They remind us that evil adapts, that it learns from our assumptions and exploits our blind spots. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people around us, how much we trust institutions without verification, and how quickly we dismiss concerns that seem too extreme to be credible. Their victims deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in criminal files, but as real people whose lives were stolen by individuals who chose to embrace the darkest possibilities of human nature. They were patients seeking healing, young women chasing dreams, vulnerable people looking for safety, lost souls seeking meaning, and ordinary individuals who had the misfortune to cross paths with predators who had perfected the art of seeming harmless. These killers prove that monsters are real, that they walk among us, and that they're often far more dangerous than the obvious threats we fear. They remind us that vigilance isn't paranoia, that questioning authority isn't disrespect, and that protecting the vulnerable isn't optional if we want to call ourselves civilized. In the end, perhaps the most chilling truth about Jane Toppen, Francisco de Assis Pereira, Robert Hansen, Adolfo Constanzo, Leonard Lake, and Charles Ng isn't what they did, but how easily they did it. They didn't need supernatural powers or elaborate schemes. They just needed to understand human nature well enough to exploit it, and they needed a society that preferred comfortable assumptions to uncomfortable truths. They're gone now, but the conditions that created them remain. The question isn't whether there are others like them out there. The question is whether we're finally ready to see them before they perfect their craft.